Okay, Ji. Assalamu alaikum. Let's begin the PIDE webinar. Thank you very much for participating in this. This is our second webinar on public sector enterprises. The originator of this webinar is Mr. Istiqbal Mehdi, and I must first welcome him. Istiqbal Mehdi, he has initiated this. He has taken the initiative on public sector enterprises. He's an old public sector enterprises hand. He's been in the board of investment. He's run the public sector enterprises. He's been in DFI, so he knows it all. And we've got a great panel with Istiqbal Mehdi. We've got Salim Raza, the former governor of the central bank, state bank. We've got Afaq Tiwana. He's an agro-based industry expert as well. I think he was a chairman of the Zarait Rakyati Bank. We've got Aisha Aziz from the Park Brunei Investment. And we've got, of course, Istiqbal Mehdi. And then we've got Tasneem Nurani, former secretary Commerce and has been in various SOEs, a well-known, intellectual. Then we've got Sikandar Khan, also another famous professional from the public sector enterprises, has managed and initiated Millet Tractor, so he's a well-known entrepreneur in that sector. So let me first begin by welcoming Istiqbal Mehdi to start the discussion by his thoughts, because as I said, he's the originator of the thing. Then I'll turn to the rest of the panel. Mehdi sir.
Thank you very much, Nadeem. Let me welcome to all the other participants. It is a pleasure having such a august gathering, and I must say that we got so encouraged by the discussion which we have had last time, in that we did not hesitate even once to have the second one going now. Well, if I can straight away request Mr. Salim Raza. You have already, Nadeem, you have already introduced them about the various participants. All that I would like to mention is the subject which we have initiated today. That is DFIs, which is one of the very important area in which at one time, if I can say, that the DFIs of Pakistan were quite well known, and I would say that a number of activities, number of accomplishments, number of things which we are seeing today is because of some of the work of some of the DFIs of the past. Unfortunately, we have not continued the same pace as we did sometime in 60s and 70s, and maybe even up to 80s. And probably we shall be touching this subject during the course of our discussion today. So now, without wasting any more time with my words, may I request Mr. Salim Raza to commence and give her his words of wisdom.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Istiqbal Mehdi. Let me just generally introduce the subject, and then we can all join in and take the subject further, because there's so many dimensions. I don't necessarily want to make a speech on it now, but just introduce what I thought we could talk about in the context of Pakistan. Now, Mr. Nadeemullah has pointed out that we gave up, the sort of planning that is necessary to get the optimal synergy out of our national resources and produce, composite growth, self-sustaining growth that could reach 7%, which is what our economy needs, and what our population growth, which is higher than our neighbors, 2% versus 1% needs at least 7%. We can't seem to manage more than 5% for a couple of years before we develop a balance of payments crisis, and then we have to end up with the IMF and in austerity programs. Now, so for the last 30 years, our growth rate has been about 4%. When we opted out of planning, we gave leadership to investment and growth. For investment and growth, we gave leadership to the private sector. The private sector have done a reasonable job, but there we are. We're at 4% sustainable, and for the rest, one-offs. The reason is our investment has varied between 11% and 15% over the last 20 years now. The highest rates we had were in the 90s, and then sometime around 2005 and 2006, we reached about 20%. But since then, it's been consistently low, and this is where we stand today. Anyhow, irrespective of all this, the fact is that 80% of the economic activity in our country, which is the small farmer, and 89% of our farms are under 12.5 acres, and all the SME in manufacturing, in services, amount to employ 80% of our labor. And these are people who function largely outside outside the interest of our commercial banking system. Now, the reality is that whichever way you look at it, whether it's planned or whether you have to create this impetus for integrating the different parts of our economy into a consistent sort of conveyor belt, or a sort of a pyramid that's viable, because things move up from the bottom. It cannot be done without development finance. Whether the economy is planned or it's not planned, if you've got 80% who do not have sustainable access to finance, or insufficient access, or no access, because it hasn't been done anywhere in the world. If you look at the larger emerging markets now, this is a responsibility. We have an unusual system, structure for our banking system among emerging markets, among the leading emerging markets today. We've got a predominantly private sector-owned commercial banking system, 80% private. National Bank and the Bank of Punjab are the two government banks of any size. If you look at countries, even countries like Japan in their growth phase, they didn't nationalize banks, but ensured that banks were allocated to particular karatsus, to their particular conglomerates, and they worked primarily for those conglomerates. The same thing in Germany. Germany is still about 55% a public banking system. The Landesbanken and the Landesbanks and I'm forgetting the name of the smaller banks under the Landesbanks, are public sector banks, and they finance SME, they finance agriculture, they finance development. Korea nationalized the banking system during its high growth phase from the 60s to the mid 80s, late 80s. India has a 72% government-owned banking system. China, 94% government-owned banking system. And countries like Brazil, their development finance institutions, which are public sector institutions, are about 50% of the banking system. And Mendes, which is their lead development bank, and about 25% of the system as a whole, does more project finance than the World Bank does annually. So even Turkey, about 35% government-owned, and directed towards particular parts of the economy. We have nothing. That's the point. That's the subject, really, that irrespective of who is going to direct the growth, the government has to take note of this market failure, that we really do not have institutions that can play both, not just a lending role for the SMEs, for the small farmer. There has to be an advisory role. We cannot do project finance for infrastructure. All our long-term projects, all our power projects have to be government guaranteed. We cannot put together, projects where lending syndicates, where the payment is going to come not from a government guarantee, but the cash flow of the project. We don't have that. We should have had that in our power entities. But wherever you find the need for long-term project finance, the government has to go out and intervene. So SME, agriculture, housing, the land of the free, the home of the brave, the bastion of capitalism, America, the housing market, which is huge, it's about 80% of GDP, 85, lending to housing is about 85% of US GDP. It's colossal. Ours is 0.2% of GDP. That housing market is backed by Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are public sector entities, because they provide the refinance to commercial banks or guarantees to commercial banks. They do about 40% of the mortgages in America on their, either guarantee commercial banks or refinance commercial banks. And their role is about 40 to 50% of total housing finance. So the government steps in everywhere there is a big need, and the private sector will not volunteer to lead, because the private sector, their obligations to shareholders, their context is relatively low risk and liquid exposure. Liquid means, by and large, shorter term. Hence, coming back to Pakistan, if you add up Zarai Taraqi Bank, Housing Bank, SME Bank, of course, is moribund, so that it doesn't matter. They're tiny. Together, these to about 400 billion rupees, which is about less than 3 or 4% of the total banking exposure. What the commercial banks do for SME and agriculture is seasonal. For SMEs is short-term working capital finance, which is not what they need. They need advice. They need direction. They need help with technology. They need finance for long-term assets, and they don't get this from the commercial banks. So therefore, essentially, we have left them out. A farmer gives up about 40% of his margin, his seed, his fertilizer, and it takes a margin there. The Aarti buys his crop exclusive and pays him something exclusive of the interest he charges for the loan he gave him at the beginning of the process. Then you have the mandi's margin, then you have the transporter, then you have the retailer taking his margin. So there's about 40% lost. And the result is the farmer, and we'll hear much more about this from Mr. Afaf Tiwana. The result is the farmer cannot invest back in his facilities at all. But the small farmer cannot afford to buy a tractor, but it isn't easy to lease new machinery. The machineries we've got and the harvesters that we've got, by and large, these people do manage to lease, are old, they're inefficient, and there's a huge need for the provision of machinery in agriculture. It could be transformative. And we're not setting ourselves up for any of this. So my introduction to this subject is that we have market failure with respect to development finance. It is widespread. Our commercial banks will play a marginal role, and that's fair enough, because they are not development finance institutions. Now here, without the government stepping in, we are not going to get the kind of institutions we need. Some private sector banks have more initiative than others. They may be able to commence a process, but they cannot lead the way. The way has to be led by a reinforcement of the institutions we have. Either we build them up on a big scale, capitalize them, build them up, or we go some other way. We take institutions like the Bank of Punjab or Sindh Bank and part of National Bank, merge them and make them our development finance institution that does SME and agriculture, because we do have branches all over the place. I think there's little logic for a provincial bank, which is the preferred beneficiary for provincial government deposits, using all that to do credit cards in outside their own province and car loans in other cities outside their own province. They should be investing their money back in the province, in the SME area, in the agricultural area. I mean, that's one way of looking at it. I'm not saying that's what we should do, but we do have to figure out how we move to within the next 2-3 years, creating robust development finance capacity. And I'll just leave it there. We'll come back to some of these things later, perhaps.
Thank you, Salim. Thank you very much. जी, let me turn to Aisha. Aisha baby, please बताइए. सलीम रजा साहब कहते हैं कि market failure है. If I put it to you, it's not market failure, it's government failure. We had development financial institutions that we ran into the ground, and we still have some development financial institutions like these Park Libya, Park, etc., that we don't know what they do, but they're still around and they manage small portfolios, very good jobs. But what is it? Is it market failure? Is it government failure? And secondly, मुझे please बता दें, सलीम रजा साहब ने बड़ा अच्छा खाका खींचा है. बट ये डेवलपमेंट फाइनेंशियल इंस्टीट्यूशन की हमारी हिस्ट्री जो है, मेरे ख्याल में तो इट्स अ वेरी स्लिपरी स्लोप, वेरी डेंजरस हिस्ट्री. और एक और चीज है, आज जबकि तारिक बनूरी को निकाल दिया गया है, तो कैन वी क्रेडिबली हैव एन इंडिपेंडेंट पब्लिक बैंक सिस्टम when we cannot even credibly have a CEO in our system? तो ये बताइए जरा, इस बड़ी पेचीदा बात है, इस पर जरा गौर करिए. आई थिंक इट्स मोर गवर्नमेंट फेलियर देन मार्केट फेलियर.
No, thank you very much. I'm glad you've asked me right after Salim Saab's very interesting presentation. एक तो ये है कि हम DFIs, the 7 companies, the mistake we make is calling them a DFI because these are investment banks. They are capitalized, well capitalized, but they're structured in a way that they have no recourse to long-term money. So it's a miracle that they are still around and that they have not gone under. Because had they done any of the things that traditional DFIs used to do, which is long-term project finance, I think we would have had a very short lifespan. But then we come back to the question that should it be, private sector, government failure? So here the government has approximately 90 billion rupees of capital tied up in entities that are viable, sure, but not really useful. And how can that capital be better deployed towards value addition or towards true development is something that I have been talking to my regulators for 18 years now. Because that 90 billion is literally earning the government something like a 5% return on investment. So it is largely they're irrelevant companies, but here's the capital. And the way to deploy this properly in almost all the areas you said, Salim Saab, whether it's agri-finance or through warehouse receipts or operating leases for agro sector or for construction sector or private equity, all of these things can be done by just a little tweaking of these entities. And that is to say, all right, they are not lending arms. They are not banks. They should not be regulated like banks, because the moment you regulate them with banks, you're telling them to go and lend. And because they can't really lend long term, they end up doing nothing. So their avenues are constricted. But if you were to tell them that, go out, do venture capital, do operating leases, do, the thing, private equity, the things where you can make a difference, provide seed capital, do SMEs. For that, we are actually there are regulations which discourage us from doing that. So, that question on what should we do, we should first of all get this 80, in fact, it's more than 80 billion now. Use this capital in the right way. Create a regulatory framework that allows this capital to be deployed properly. For each of these companies, if you think about it, you have a CEO, you have a CFO, you have a sort of a structure that is unnecessary. And in fact, all you needed to do was have one entity, merge them, have one entity, and then have 7 funds underneath each. And for each fund, you say, you do venture capital, you do operating leases, because all of these businesses on their own are highly profitable. They are required. They are what is going to actually drive real development, if you think about it. And, as somebody who's on the ground, I've worked in the, if you call it the DFI sector, I call it investment banking. I see when you want to do things, you are held back by regulations. So that question of wanting to merge
Aisha, baby,
Bank of
sorry to
Punjab.
interrupt you. Aisha, sorry to interrupt you, but these entities are not even doing investment banking. They do no underwriting. They do no corporate finance. They are just there with this portfolio. It is totally inactive, and I don't know what they're doing. This seems to be bureaucracy. Sorry, I'm being a little critical. The second thing is that
what I'm
we
no,
did have
if I
we
could
did have
just answer.
we did have leasing companies. What happened?
Capital, if you look at leasing companies, they did exactly what banks were doing. They were going and leasing corporate customers. They never went into true leasing of cash-backed financing of SMEs. There's actually only one leasing company in the whole country that did stay true to the SME sector. I think 60% of their portfolio is medium-sized companies, and that's still around. That's Oryx Leasing. But to come back to your question, the reason why they're not doing investment banking is because they are structured and monitored and regulated like banks. So if I were to want to lend, let's set up a company to do operating leases, and that's a very, very important business. Our construction companies, for example, we can't compete with Chinese companies because our equipment is 40, 50-year-old. Nobody can really, the smaller companies can't invest in those equipment, and there's nobody to do operating leases for them. But if as a TFI, we want to do that, there are actual regulations which bar us. And the reason is that we are structured like banks. We are asked to lend. We have to keep certain proportion of our portfolio in core activities. Core activities shown as lending. So a lot of these activities that I've mentioned, by the regulatory framework, we are unable to do them. And hence you find us doing, odd jobs. We lend to the people that possibly banks won't lend to. Or we'll put that extra funds that we have in government securities or in capital markets. Because at the end of the day, we also have to provide a return. Now you change the regulatory framework and you tell us, look, you're allowed to go and invest in vehicles that do operating leases. You're free to go and invest it, take equity stakes, provide venture capital, do all of these activities, and then you'll find us doing something which is meaningful. But to call us DFIs when we have recourse only to short-term money market lines, and then to sort of flog us wherever, every platform for not doing project finance, for example, is a little, it's I don't know, it's not really useful. So change the structure of the beast. When you go and do a joint venture with another country and they're giving you $50 million, why must that $50 million go into an antiquated DFI structure? Why can't that $50 million be used as a private equity fund? So, and you can still change. It's not that you can't, but we're stuck with the structure that was created 30 years ago.
Aisha Bibi, who's your regulator?
State Bank.
State Bank.
State Bank regulators, yes.
Okay.
So we have an issue over there. You change the structure. You tell us to do investment banking, become holding companies, set up the vehicles that are actually able to reach out to for example, if I could give you an example, it took us 2 years, more than 2 years, to get permission from the central bank to set up mudarbas, because we thought a mudarba could do the equipment rental business. Another mudarba could do private equity better. You can turn around and say, why didn't mudarbas survive? They were around for 30 years. All of them have fizzled out. But again, they fizzled out because they didn't have the right business models. Most of them were doing exactly what commercial banks were doing on a smaller scale. But if you were to use the same vehicles to do these exciting new things, then you can make a difference. You can raise money from capital markets. You have the liquidity. These are listed entities. But what happens? Because we're treated like banks, we cannot invest in mudarbas. So, there has to be someone who looks at the regulations and says, let's use these entities.
Let me turn to Afaq Tiwana. Afaq Saab, you have been with Zarai Taraqqiyati Bank and you, mashallah, are an investor in agriculture. You've done some good things. I've not seen you for a while. Can you please tell us why DFIs should exist? Especially when the Zarai Taraqqiyati Bank is almost a zombie. Am I right if I say it's a zombie bank, or should it be properly allowed to function now? Afaq Saab, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here. Just to correct the record, I am not with the Zarai Taraqqiyati Bank, nor have I ever worked with them.
So sorry. Okay.
I was nominated. I was appointed chairman of the board. However, I resigned before joining for personal reasons. I felt I really wasn't capable enough to steer that organization, essentially in the state that I found it once I visited over there. And I thought somebody more competent should be looking after that institution. However, having said that, talking about DFIs and the very macro picture that Salim Saab and Aisha have painted, I'd like to essentially take you to the ground level. My whole idea is regarding agriculture, So, of course, we have a DFI in the shape of ZTBL. ZTBL is essentially extinct at this time. They function, but that's about the extent of it. Then within agriculture, we see a lot of the multilateral agencies investing in this field. Essentially, we have just now, if I were to just quote an example, we have the LEAF program, which is the locust relief effort that the World Bank is funding $200 million for local locust relief. And all of it, just goes into empire building. They are going to buy all these maybe 50 or 100 vehicles and a couple of planes and whatever else. And, there are another 100 people to be employed, and forever and ever, they are now going to be part of the expenditure that we will have to incur through our budget. So the multilaterals that are funding, if maybe in my old age, I'm a bit more cynical, I don't know, but I think the multilaterals know extremely well that we will not be able to utilize the $200 million to the best benefit of our people and for this sector. However, there may be wheels within wheels, and that's how it is. When we were asked from our organization, the farmers organization that I represent, we felt that the private sector should be built. Today, drone technologies are around, satellite imagery is around, everything is there. And some large companies were willing to invest in the hundreds of drones that would be required to overcome this kind of a menace. And then when this menace is not there, then these companies would be spraying our crops. So this is the kind of multilateral DFI mismanagement that happens in the public sector. It's always empire building. Let's open another department. Let's spend another $200 million over there. Now, having said that, we've done some development finance work with HBL. And only this year, we've had kind of a mid-level, mid-scale pilot. And in that pilot, our whole idea has been to develop service providers for the agriculture sector. So if I were to kind of take you through the spectrum of agriculture finance, so it starts with the input manufacturer, people who make seed and fertilizer and make pesticide, etc. And they sell to the informal sector, to their people who are their dealers, the commission agents, the artis, and they in turn sell to the farmer. And then again, the informal sector buys from the farmer. So on both ends, the farmer is dealing with the informal sector in the form of commission agent on both ends. And sometimes it's the same person. So in the HBL experiment, which has been tremendously successful, it's quite new, and some numbers are already there. The 40% increase in the net income of the farmer is well documented now, because we were able to formalize the two ends, the commerce of buying and the commerce of selling. So HBL went ahead and had contracts done up for the farmer to sell directly to the processor rather than going to the mandi or to the arti. And that was a really successful model. So setting up, here is the opportunity. I feel that the opportunity is setting up service provision, top class service provision for the agriculture sector. And that way, it really doesn't matter if that machine is running on a small farmer's field or on a large farmer's field. The machine will be doing a certain specification standard of service. So this is something that we have done. I was told we'd have 10 minutes to speak. I could go on talking.
Thank you
about
very
this.
much, Afaq Sab. Thank you. Afaq Sab, Istiqbal Sab, if you will allow me, let me bring in Tasneem Noorani here, because I think, Tasneem Sab, the issue has been well posed. Salim Raza says it's a market failure. Two recent speakers have said there's a huge government failure. There's an over-regulation by the central bank, whom we are giving independence now. So they will be given independence to make the banking system even narrower. Second thing, Tasneem Saab, you've been in government for a long time. You've been secretary for a long time. You know the government sector very well. Please explain to us, do we have credible governance to be able to make credible DFIs or credible anything? As I said, Tariq Banoori has been today fired, and it lays out a plan for us that nobody can survive in the government is independently. And Afaq Sab has also told us that Zarai Taraqqiyati Bank has been kind of looted. Looted is a professional term. In economics, it's used a lot. Institutions are looted. And yes, we know financial institutions, even Fannie Mae, Freddie Mae were looted. So we know our financial institutions were looted. So please, Tasneem Saab, what do you say? How can we make credible institutions?
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for giving me the opportunity. I'm not an expert. I have never worked in a DFI. However, having spent about close to 40 years in government, all the factors that are mentioned, one is experienced in some form or the other. And the fact is that DFIs as a concept is a great concept. I think the initial industrialization in Pakistan can be attributed to it. And as Salim Raza Saab mentioned, all the countries that are worth their name are really using long-term finance companies, whatever they call them, funded by the government, these banks, and they've been doing long-term finance. And it's very visible in our industrial effort. We've been talking about industrial efforts, and we've been talking about achieving things. But the fact is that in our country, it's only the established families which are really developing, and whatever little industrialization is taking place through them. A new entrepreneur, has almost no chance in entering a significant, industrial project. And that is why we are confined to agriculture, to textiles, and that is our pride of our industry, continues to be for the last 70 years, and I don't see any break in that. These people who are the top families, the spare money, they put it into a bank, they put it into a media channel, they sort of put up a power plant, anything makes good money. But there is no industrialization, because the genuine entrepreneur who's on to really finding a process and putting a manufacturing industry and making a decent profit is completely excluded, because commercial banks, as they are structured now, are not in a position to undertake that. They are unfortunately, since a long time, have a very easy way of making money, and they're making tons of money by just lending back to the government. And I don't think that was the concept of a commercial bank. And as Madam Aisha stated, that unfortunately, whatever DFIs currently exists are also not structured the way that they should be. And if they want to enter into a new market, like as she said, encouraging people to buy high quality, high cost machinery, that's not allowed. So I mean, it's for the State Bank really to consider these things critically and sort of find a solution. The industrialization is only going to be possible if there are DFIs. But the problem is that since the DFIs are expected to be state-owned, unfortunately, a record in keeping a arm's length between a state-owned enterprise and the core government has not been very good. And I think India's experience was also similar. I think they converted, I think in the 90s, they also sort of did away with most of their DFIs, what I have read. And ICICI was, one of the companies that was converted into a scheduled bank, and initially it was a DFI. And I think they're also considering very seriously to go back to the original model. So if I were to recommend, and I would say, yes, there should be DFIs, but my apprehension would be, how do you save a DFI from the government itself? How do you insulate? How do you, we've had models of bringing professionals into state-owned enterprises. But when it comes to the crunch, when it comes to the big decisions, when it comes to really the critical matters, unfortunately, our government machinery, both the ministries and the ministers and the MPAs and MNAs, because there's money in this, there is, they have, let's say if there's an DFIs and they can lend you ₹1 billion to set up a project, then the MNAs and then the political parties will, the important people will set in. And that has been the experience, and we haven't really been able to find a solution to that. And I think there are very few exceptions. And unfortunately, things have gotten worse in the last few years. Initially, there was few centers of power, and therefore people had to deal with only few centers of power. Unfortunately, in this government, what has happened is that in the form of deregulation, in the form of having 200 chief ministers in a province as a model of democracy, we have hundreds of power centers now, creating further confusion in government machinery and in organizations that run under the government. So my take on this would be that I'm convinced that DFIs are essential. I'm convinced that this country hasn't really developed industrially at the pace that it should have developed with such enterprising people with great ideas, because there is no money available to the people who are not already with high collateral. And the DFIs were supposed to be the ones which were supposed to be filling that gap. But my concern is that we have to find a way to really insulate these DFIs if we were to have them in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Istiqbal Mehdi
Salim,
Saab.
may I?
Ji, please go ahead,
Salim,
Salim
may I
Saab.
intervene
Go ahead, Salim.
just for a second before Mr. Let me give you an example of what I mean by market failure. On the one hand, our textile industry claims it's going to invest a lot of money in the next 2-3 years because there's been a transfer of orders from the traditional textile exporters who, with branded goods, who were tied to the big buyers in Europe and America. There's been a transfer from them, from China, from post-COVID, from Bangladesh, from Vietnam. We're getting more orders directly from those manufacturers who sit abroad, those branded companies. And so we're going to invest $2-3 billion more, and we're going to, textile industry will sort of shine again and lead the way. The reality is that our cotton crop is about 5 million bales shorter than it should have been. I don't know where it is. It 7 million bales, 7.5, 6.5, but it's well short of what it's been in the past. Now, there are reasons why the farmer has stopped. Mr. Afaq Tiwana might shed light on this. But my point is, if your lead industry cannot, nurture its, the people who produce its raw material, to the extent that we might have to import between $2 and $3 billion of cotton, raw cotton this year. And, so who cares about this? Where should leadership lie? Given that it's got, we need a big cotton crop. In the 80s, we were 12, 13 million bales. India was 17 million bales. India was the world's largest cotton importer, or one of the world's largest cotton importers. India now produces 35 million bales, and this is the result of a concerted effort. It's these, GM seed people. It's appropriate subsidies to the farmer to allow him. It's loans for machineries to farmers. The government, there's big government subsidy that goes into agriculture, but on the other hand, it pays off. You pick it up on the production side. Now, where is the counterpart to this in our planning? But let's say we don't have planning, but why shouldn't our industrialists see the need to co-invest, to form a pool that focuses on seeds? I know some are talking about it. Focuses on seeds, that reaches to, looks at the problems of the farmer, makes sure he is supported in ways, and some of the ways that Mr. Afaq Tiwana mentioned, so that his margin goes up, so that he can reinvest. Now, who can make that happen? When this is market failure, whether it's government cause, whether it's private sector cause, but isn't this a glaring example of, complete misalignment of interest?
Salim, let me ask you a question. Why is the central bank, whose domain is financial stability, why is the central bank supervising penny ante DFIs that don't even amount to 0.5% of the financial system? Isn't the central bank is overreaching and trying to create financial stability by deadening the financial sector?
When it comes to DFIs, there's a particular reason. We own 50%, the other 50% is owned by a foreign government. To get them all on the same page in order to create a centralized model that, like Aisha suggested, which is a very good idea. But then there's also Pak Libya. Who to deal with in Libya? There's a Pak Iran. Who wants to merge with Pak Iran? People are concerned about sanctions. So it's not easy. It's a very tempting idea. It's very logical. It should be done, but it's not up to the government of Pakistan to pull everything together. There are foreign governments, they have their sensitivities, and all sorts of reasons why we as a single government may not be able to persuade all 7 of them to merge their resources together with the government to create a single entity. That is then, as Aisha suggested, I think that's a very good idea. But the problem here is political and diplomatic. So why does the central bank regulate? Well, it won't make any difference. Who else will regulate it? SECP? Will SECP give it any more leeway? I don't know. That's not the issue. The solution is the right one, but achieving it will need diplomacy, tact, and persuasion.
can I
आयशा बेबी आप कह रही हैं, जी बताइए।
देखिए, आपने 3-4 एरियाज आइडेंटिफाई किए, आफाक तिवाना साहब ने कहा, now think about, I'll talk about Park Brunei. If I were to go to my shareholders and my board and say, look, we're an agrarian economy, we have no infrastructure, we have no warehouses. Why don't we change our structure and be in the business of making and renting this kind of infrastructure? I can tell you that my board will have no problem. The Brunei people will have no problem. Why should the government have a problem? Somebody needs to pick this by the horn and say, let's do this. Or if I'm I don't know, Libya or Iran, and I say, look, I want to be in the business of operating leases. I'll take the residual value risk. I will own this and I will do this as a business. I don't need to lend 5 billion to Nishat, which is what I'm doing right now. Instead, I will put this 5 billion in this activity. All it needs is a little attention. Then you don't even need to consolidate. You can give each of these 7 companies a specific role. Whether it is private, even venture capital. I get 100, hundreds of proposals, and out of those, 3 or 4 are really good.
पर आयशा बीबी ये बता दें, अभी पाक ब्रुनाई करती क्या?
So पाक ब्रुनाई कोशिश करती है कि ये सारे काम करे, but because हम regulated है, हम बड़े थोड़े extent तक करते हैं. We realize that there's 700 billion rupees worth of dead assets, non-performing loans on banks' balance sheets. So we did one thing, which is we created an area where we do revival financing. We take a dead asset, we provide them with some equity, with little bit of debt, and we try to turn it around. And we've done some, but because we are regulated again, there's only a certain extent that I can do. Otherwise, the state bank would penalize me.
Another question. I'm sure you're a public limited company, so your accounts are not private. What is the return on equity on your funds?
8%. In a good year, we give 12%. Again, I'll explain why. If we've got 10 billion rupees of capital, there is no way I can leverage my book by more than 2 times, because and then create those assets, because all of the funding available to me from the market is short term.
तो आपको ब्रुनाई वाले कहते नहीं कि पैसे वापस कर दें, आपको ब्रुनाई वाले कहते नहीं पैसे वापस कर दें, 8% तो दुनिया में कुछ भी नहीं है.
कुछ भी नहीं है, और उस पे भी डिवैल्यूएशन पे रिटर्न 0 मिलता है. मेरा आंसर ये है कि ब्रुनाई को कोई कंसर्न नहीं है if we do this or if we own warehouses and rent them out. They have no, so it's our failure. If we go to them and we say, look, you've given us the money, we'd rather use it in this activity, they will not say don't do it. But the fact that nobody in the ministry...
What is your board doing? Please explain to me. I'm very concerned about boards. What is your board doing?
Well, the boards do not that much, because again...
They're government officials or they're private sector people?
They're government officials on side, so you can't blame any one side. And the fact is that the way we are structured, there's only so much we can do. I give you the example of revival financing. That's a business on its own. That's what one DFI should only be doing that. But in order to do that, we need to buy these assets off the bank's books. In order to buy those assets, we need to be regulated differently. I can't be regulated by the state bank and invest in dead assets at the same time. So what we've done is we've created separate vehicles that do this activity, and that they're regulated by the SECP. So to answer Salim Saab's question, yes, if you set up specialized vehicles for private equity, for agro-finance, for leasing, for SME, you can do it under the SECP framework. Because there is a area of regulations that allow you to do that investment activity.
Great.
You cannot. So it's just that, a little bit of tinkering here and there. Somebody needs to look at this money and say, look, there's no return to us. The only return comes when interest rates are falling and all of us buy bonds, and then we can give you a slightly higher return in that year.
Thank you, Aisha Bibi. Let me turn to Sikandar Saab. Sikandar Saab, ye bataiye, Millet Tractors, very reputable firm, is a very profitable firm. You've done very well, mashallah. Do you need financing to grow? And if you do, How can't you get it from the market? You've got a very, very good reputation. Can't you get it from the market? And what is the return on your shareholder value? Sikandar sir.
Sir, Sikandar साहब ने join नहीं किया, I think.
Join नहीं किया. And let me go back to Istiqbal Mehdi sir. Istiqbal Mehdi sir, can you sum up this discussion and tell me क्या करना चाहिए?
I would love to do that. Nadeem, if you allow me, I am tempted to go slightly see things in the historical perspective. You see, first of all, these 7 joint ventures which we have, unfortunately, this we don't recall very often what was the original objective, and that original objective is still there because we are committed to that, and that is the objective was that Pakistan and that specific joint venture partner country should be having certain joint ventures together and trying to find some industries and enterprises, create their own, make a profit, and be together because on the basis of that partnership. And so that is one area, and so it's not easy to forget and about this agreement which has been signed between the 2 countries and bring them together and make one entity out of the 7. That's one. Number 2, while Aisha was talking about it, I was remembering. You see, I have been MD of 2 of these joint ventures. One is Pak Kuwait, another was Pak Iran. Pak Iran, I was there just to set it up. So I was there for about 1 year just to set up Pak Iran. Now the thing is the objective there was to bring the 2 countries, get the best out of the 2 countries combination and can set up an enterprise. And when I was setting up Pak Iran, there was a long discussion between Pakistan delegation and the Iranian delegation, and tried to find what is it, where can we go in, where can we have together as a comparative advantage and set up certain enterprises. And I'm sure the same thing must have happened with other joint ventures when they were set up. So that's one. So first of all, my response to this is that we have to remember that what is the original objectives. And now with that original objective, it is a possibility that you might even get at much more than 8% rate of return, which you were talking about. It could be even more. But the thing is that have we worked on that? Have we tried for that? In fact, even when Pak China was being set up, I was a member of that team which was setting up, and one of our objective was that okay, let's find out the areas where we can join hands and get the maximum rate of return. So that is one. Secondly, Tiwana Saab, well, I'm talking to him after a very, very long time. I think last time we talked, I don't know after how many years back. So he was not very optimistic about various enterprises, state enterprises, and all that I would say is that we have to remember that what is today, the enterprises which we are seeing is not what it was. If you see now I'm talking about the development of DFIs over a period of 70 years. I'm not going to talk about 70 years, but before or in the earlier period, 60s and 70s, some of the very fine work which was done on in the economy, it is still valid. After all, WebDA, which had set up the famous Indus Basin Treaty, and then Tarbela and Mangla. Where have they come from? They came based on certain state enterprise management. Now, and to the extent that the chairman of WEBDA had in one of his speeches, which is really a known speech, where he talked about that I'm proud that this is a government by corporations. And it went to the extent, Nadeem, since I'm talking to the former Deputy Chairman Planning Commission also, that we should not forget that the third 5-year plan was, normally we talk in terms of public sector and private sector. In case of third 5-year plan, we went to that extent. We were so happy about the public sector enterprises that it was based on 3 sectors: public sector, private sector, and the corporate sector. This was the kind of, so that was the reason was that we were doing so well. As in the public corporate sector, we had attained certain areas, we had accomplished something. And I'm not talking about what happened later on and why did it happen, but what I'm saying is there are so much potential in this area where we can do that. And this is what happened, and that is why we are coming back to this DFI things. Now, when we are talking about DFIs, we are talking about, again, a number of sectors which are there today just because we somewhat worked on it. I mean, I'm just talking about again, I was in one of the, I'm MD of one of the DFI, which was NIT, but when I was holding on NIT, I was also looking after ICP. ICP was, has made enormous contribution in the area of capital market development. The mutual fund, the 26th mutual fund, which it launched in a time when nobody knew what your mutual funds are. This is what the contribution of these DFIs were. And the only thing is that we could not, somehow it was not sustained. And we were never always in a situation like we are today. But what I am trying to say is that we, through these very instruments, we have been able to attain quite a few accomplishments. And we might, if we go into and look into it, the reason for it, and make attempts, then we might be able to, at least learn from the previous experiences. And I think at this point of time, I would not take more time, because maybe all the time I'm admiring, appreciating and advocating public sector enterprises. So I would stop here, but then I'll come in later on. Thank you. Nadeem? Oh, sorry.
सर काइंडली अपने आप को अनम्यूट कर लें सर, डॉक्टर नदीम.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. How I got unmuted? Okay, folks, I think I see what you're saying. Yes, there is a crime need. Yes, there should be public banks. Yes, there should be good governance. Yes, government-led growth is working in China. Yes, everything works in the world. But I bring you back to home. We cannot credibly set an institution in place. Salim Raza Saab, so many governors, central banks have been fired. Today, Tariq Banoori, I keep saying, was fired. We have little respect for talent. If I quote to you Zingali's and Raghurajan, very famous papers that they've said, they've put out a long time ago. Raghurajan has written a couple of books on those two. Finance is not important for setting up industry, they say. They say finance follows ideas. What is important is ideas, not finance. And unfortunately, the model that we had in the 60s was devoid of ideas. It was a model of giving cheap credit along with all kinds of protections and subsidies, which set up a rent-seeking industry, which is still, we are ruining the day. Secondly, we also have a problem that NDFC and IDBP, all those things were looted. They actually were left the government with a huge, huge bad debt, and the government had to deal with the bad asset. Before I go on, let me invite two other people that I see in the audience. Arshad Zaman sir, would you like to say something? Arshad Zaman, former chief economist, always has some interesting thoughts. Arshad sir, can I bring you in for a short while?
Yeah, if I can figure this out, can you hear me?
I can hear you. Sure.
We
Go
can
ahead.
hear you.
I think this has been a fascinating discussion and something that is an education to me. My take on this is slightly different. I think what Salim Raza said, I agree with very much with what he has said. I think if we break it up, I think we are all agreed that development is a legitimate task that the market alone will not take for a variety of reasons. And isko market failure na kahe, log bura maan jate hain. Magar in order to promote the development of something large as Pakistan, there is some need for coordination, some need for provision of information. And so there is a task for a non-market coordinator of a unified effort. The task of planning Pakistan is a little more difficult than running a fertilizer factory. And so that has to be taken into account. Now, the second point, I think, which everybody is agreed on, I'm really impressed by Ms. Aisha's comments, that is the role of finance in promoting development, bada ho ya chota ho, that role is there. And the example of MITI was cited in Japan. Salim cited the US example of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac. You could go earlier to TVA, elsewhere. Yani this idea that Mr. Hayek promoted out of his fear of the rise of Hitler and the Bolshevik Revolution, कि कहीं England उधर वैसा ना हो जाए इसलिए government must be whittled down, that really doesn't apply here anymore. So if development has to be promoted and if finance is a part of it, whether small or part, we have to alter the philosophy of public sector management. This idea that public sector should step aside and let the market take care, it just hasn't worked. It's bad in logic, it's bad in experience. The difficulty particularly here is that hamare yahan, there is the framework of law and justice has not been established. Whenever we make comparisons to England and America and Lesotho and Venezuela, it just obfuscates, because you can take any truth and say yes, but it's not true in Botswana. अब उसमें कितने लोगों को पता है कि बोत्सवाना में क्या हो रहा है, क्या नहीं हो रहा है. So the questions of ineffective regulation of laws वगैरह comes down to the fact that the infrastructure of governance is not there and cannot be assumed to be there because somebody has written a paper in the American Economic Review about America. So instead of looking to Vietnam and Korea and Japan and God knows where else, we have to look at the reality on the ground, realize that we have a very imperfect system, and devise good enough solutions in which the government and the private sector have an equal role. And that, I believe, is the case for development finance companies. I believe that without finance, you cannot just write glossy reports about vision and mission and publish them. Usse development nahi honegi. So that is my 2 pennies worth on this subject.
Very
but
good. Thank you.
I was
Thank you,
greatly
Arshad
informed.
Let me bring in Naseem Beg साहब. Naseem Beg साहब, अर्शद साहब कह रहे हैं कि गवर्नमेंट को जरूर लाना चाहिए डेवलपमेंट फाइनेंस पे. सलीम रजा साहब भी कह रहे हैं. जरा ये बताइए कि हमारी हुकूमत क्या ऐसी चीज़ें रन कर सकती है जब हमारी हुकूमत हर चीज़ को पोलिटिसाइज कर देती है? PIA से लेके HEC तक पोलिटिसाइज हो गई है, हर एरिया पोलिटिसाइज हो गया, किसी एरिया में प्रोफेशनलिज्म नहीं। ट्रंप फॉर एग्जांपल कुछ नहीं कर सका US में, उसने अपने मिनिस्टर जरूर फायर किए पर टेक्निकली जो डिपार्टमेंट से ऑटोनमस डिपार्टमेंट उनमें कुछ नहीं कर सका। तो हमारे यहाँ जब ये क्रेडिबिलिटी नहीं, कैन वी हैव credible DFIs, credible regulation, credible systems of governance? Naseem Beg साहब।
सर सॉरी, नसीम बेग साहब डिस्कनेक्ट हो गए हैं सर।
चले गए। ओके जी, सलीम रजा साहब आप बताइए, what do you think? I think the problem is governance. If we don't have these credible systems, we set up DFIs, we'll set up for failure. Would you agree?
That's certainly how it's turned out, but but they did work once. I think the reason PICIC worked is that the PICIC board had the World Bank in it. The PICIC board had other multilaterals on it. I'm talking about the early 60s, up to the mid 60s. The PICIC board had the Bank of America on it as a shareholder. So that the presence of these multilaterals really put PICIC at arm's length from direct government interference. And the chairman or the CEOs of PICIC were guided in truth by the board, because all proposals for foreign currency loans that were utilized by PICIC, the foreign currency loans, all proposals had to be approved by the board. So the board had great strength. Now, because the government also had to borrow from the multilaterals, so it had to listen to them. But now, if we're going to look at Pakistan where nothing that is public can have independence, i.e. anything owned by government also has to be managed by government. If that is what we're assuming will happen, and by being managed by government means being prey and vulnerable to all the self-interest of the various politicians involved in this process of governance, if you assume that that is what will happen, then I don't know what we're talking about as the way forward. If we genuinely believe that an institution is worth being owned by the government and being run for development, and we are willing to give the board independence, and we are really willing to give the board independence. So further, under the board, the CEO is only looking at the board. Politicians cannot reach him. Well, they can reach him, but they can't influence him. His protection is the board. His goals are written, approved by the board. His performance appraisal and his bonus depends on the board. If that is the case, he'll behave differently. How do you change behavior? You change behavior by changing incentives. And if the incentives come from the board and are set by the board, of course, the institution underneath will change. Now, if you start off from the premise that that is not possible in today's Pakistan, I would hope that's not the case. I would hope it is possible, but it does need enough public opinion to support it. And unfortunately, people in government who are working in institutions, public institutions that are outside government, they all lack trust in the public sector now. And that is a big failing. When I was on the ESC, when it was functional for a short while last year, one of the people who opposed most the revival of DFIs was an ex-public servant who again would turn to the experience of what happened to PICIC. Now, what happened to PICIC? PICIC was first class till the 1970s, when it was neglected. In the 80s, it fell under it was treated like another commercial bank, and it was used to lend to God knows who, and it ended up with a lot of bad loans. Then it had to be bailed out and it died. But that's not the PICIC we need to look at. That was then under ministries. We have to look at the PICIC that existed when it had a board that had teeth. Can we recreate this again? Look, I don't think it's a question of can we do it. I just think we have to do it. Otherwise, we're going to have this missing middle to our economy forever.
Fair point. Tasim Nurani sir, tell us credibly, how can we credibly do what Salim Raza is asking? क्या हमारी गवर्नमेंट में प्रॉब्लम है कि हम क्रेडिबली किसी को इंडिपेंडेंस नहीं दे सकते? DFIs छोड़े, हमारे वाइस चांसलर्स को इंडिपेंडेंस नहीं है, वो एक हम जोक करते हैं आपस में कि वो एक सेक्शन ऑफिसर की मार है। तो ये बताइए कि ये सिस्टम में किसी को इंडिपेंडेंस मिल सकती है, ये सिस्टम चल सकता है ऐसे?
मेरा ख्याल है कि मेरे से पहले आयशा ने हाथ उठाया, आयशा को बात करने दें। आई थिंक दैट विल बी
चलिए, नो प्रॉब्लम। आयशा बेबी, गो अहेड।
लेडीज फर्स्ट।
Absolutely.
मेरा सिर्फ एक जवाब था, बिकॉज सलीम रजा साहब ने पॉइंट आउट किया, ये जो 7 DFIs हैं, इनमें कभी इन द हिस्ट्री ऑफ 40 years पॉलिटिकल इंटरफेरेंस नहीं रही है इन क्रेडिट डिसीजंस। अगर इनके कोई नॉन परफॉर्मिंग लोन्स हैं तो इट इज देयर ओन decision making, it is not interference. And the reason is that on each of these boards you've got foreign shareholders, and you've actually got 4 or 5 sovereign wealth funds invested in this country. So in a way you've already created a divorce from potential political interference. You've actually got a great vehicle that way. All you need to do is direct it in the right direction. So वो जो एक point आपने कहा था that you had foreign MNCs or banks sitting on the boards, and that created that distance. You can actually use these institutions for the same. And in fact, that's why PICIC band ho gaya, NDFC band ho gaya. These DFIs have always remained solvent and have for
But then
40
why the rate of return of why ROI of 8%?
Because of the structure. अगर आप 10 billion की capital लेकर आए हैं, no matter how profitable you are, you have to leverage this book in order to make a decent return. If you're unable to leverage that book, then it is enough to just give enough return. आप अपने खर्चे पूरे करके थोड़ा बहुत return दे दें, वो भी बहुत अच्छा है. You have to change. You see, अगर आप एक मुदारबा fund होते हैं, you need 100 million rupees, you can raise 1 billion rupees. But with us, different. We are unable to leverage ourselves because we don't have long-term lines. So we are somebody who understands the structure, and they need to create that in environment, because all the other blanks are already filled. और ये एक चीज करके, you know, I'm again talking micro, but अगर एक DFI एक काम भी कर ले, you know, Tivana Saab is here, so I'm actually very interested, and we're trying to do that. Set up silos. Just do that. Only focus on agriculture. There is going to be no interference because the board is, there's a sovereign wealth fund. So the CEO always has recourse to that protection. You know, just wanted to add that.
Okay.
Sorry.
Nadeem, मेरा जो है ना, my point of view on this, जैसे मैंने पहले कहा कि I am very skeptical about the government improving itself. जैसे सलीम ने कहा कि वो PICIC was a success and all those institutions was a success. Iqbal ने कहा कि जी WAPDA was a great thing. I think the first 20-30 years of the country were a real development formative years. You know, despite all the, जैसे आप तुम कह रहे हो, rent seeking and all that, वो ठीक है, but it was still a era in which we really developed from a scratch, and you know, we really set our course. Acha, ab, unfortunately, in this era of accountability, in this era of you know, political dominance, उस ज़माने में bureaucracy was dominant, and so therefore there were a few bad bureaucrats, but the system was working better in the sense that decision making was still possible, and you know, there was a certain independence was possible in institutions. अब देखिए आप ZTBL is also in some form a development, you know, public sector development. DFI आप कह सकते हैं कि ठीक है, बड़े projects नहीं करते, but काम उनका है कर्जे देना सीड पे और फर्टिलाइजर पे वगैरह वगैरह. अब उसकी हालत देखें आप कि the board is dysfunctional, there is no CEO, and this has been going on for years. Even when there was a CEO, it was a dysfunctional thing. And it's the union is totally politicized. It's a very strong union, and I don't see how the institution can even move. तो और कोई आप एग्जाम्पल इस वक्त मुझे नजर नहीं आता जिसमें कि पब्लिक सेक्टर ऑर्गेनाइजेशन इंडिपेंडेंटली अच्छा काम कर रही हो. आपने ये तारिक बनूरी का जिक्र किया. HEC is controlled by a law, and therefore he was probably not removable. So what they did was they brought in a new ordinance. They've sort of taken care of that. So koi chief executive is kisam ki organization ka where billions of rupees are involved, or the board of directors even, as far as fiduciary responsibilities are concerned, they have to take decisions. 2 out of 10 can go wrong. Now, but if those 2 are going to be scandalized and the board of directors and the chief executives are going to be hauled up, the others are not going to take any decisions. So unfortunately, public sector has really gone into a tangle. It's tied itself up in tangles by this issue of accountability, by political dominance, by, media trials, by media exposure. We want everything to be known even before it happens. Public sector की या किसी भी आजकल unfortunately देखिए कि गवर्नमेंट में एक मीटिंग होती है, अभी उसके फैसले भी नहीं हुए थे, उसने अगर कोई चीज इन राइटिंग हो या इंटरनल स्टोरी जो है वो शाम को आप टीवी पे सुन लेते हैं और वो जो मामला है, जो डिसीजन मेकिंग, वो खत्म हो जाती है. So we are in a very strange era in our thing, and the government is not helping sort that out, and neither are the opposition, neither the two sides are not helping each other sort out these things. I think there is a great pleasure in the politicians who are, let's say, 55, 51, 49. The 49% on the other side are quite pleased to see institutions destroyed. And they make all efforts to do that because, it gives them great pleasure in seeing the government fail. And so I think we have to really look for something which is, all these ideas are great, as Arshad Saab said, we all agree that the public finance is an absolute essential for development. As I said earlier, we see only one type of people flourishing in this country. A few banks, when we talked about 20 families in the 60s, there may be about 25 families now that are, controlling 80%, 90% of your development and finance and industry in this country. But the state is not interested in interfering. After this webinar, if you put up a proposal on, let's say, giving all the logical reasons, say, let's have, DFIs, or let's, even what Aisha is saying, let's, have deregulations or have separate regulations for these. And again, these bodies are still working because there is a foreigner sitting here. It's a very, very strange culture we have. If in an institution, if there is a 10% owner who's a foreigner of any sort, they can control it. The bureaucracy, the politician will step back and say, we don't want to annoy, that guy, because, he will say something in the international media, or he will go to the prime minister and, there'll be a hue and cry. So it's a strange thing. With our own people, we'll wreck the whole thing, we'll destroy the whole thing. But therefore, I think the solution is that if you want to make a DFI, get a foreign investor or get a multilateral sitting on the board, and entirely for the purpose, not for the purpose of investment, but for the purpose of playing as a referee. Thank you.
Security.
Dr.
Salim, you're muted.
जी, सब मसला सबसे बड़ा यही है, credible governance structures and credibility. So let me go back to the panel, but before I do, let me take this one question from the floor. Sahibzada Sayyid Farasato. Sahibzada Sayyid. जी साहिबजादा साहब अपने आप को इंट्रोड्यूस करिए और बोलिए.
जी, अस्सलाम वालेकुम, Dr. Nadeem and all the panelists. Wonderful discussions here. I am actually a PhD from University of Texas, Austin, and I run a few businesses in Karachi. Just, I want to make a cheeky comment, maybe cheeky, maybe it it has value and can be substantiated. Could it just be, I'm just going to posit this, that the invisible hand and the influential hand of the establishment whoever is the establishment is just not interested. And if they are interested, they just are thinking one thing, and that is CPEC. Could it just be that, okay, so if we are going to do something, it's just going to be, we're going to tilt in that direction, and the rest is all just gibberish, garbage talk, and let them. Just curious what your thoughts are.
ठीक ठीक चलें जी, let me go back to the panel. Who would like to speak? Istiqbal Saab, Salim, whoever.
I can take that. I don't think, I think the establishment has also very limited views. I think they are interested in their own industry flourishing, whatever is under them, and obviously they are interested in CPEC, but they're not really bothered. I mean, if you put up some good DFI, or if you were to have a successful industrial loaning, I don't think that they would discourage that. And I don't think their training really pushes them into encouraging it or pushing for it, because I think they're neither financial experts nor is the their outlook really trained for that. So my answer to that question is that I don't think that they are not neither stopping it nor encouraging it. They've got their own interests, so therefore, if their own interests don't clash with this, they couldn't be bothered if it whatever the government decides to do in this sector.
Thank you जी. Next जी, मेहदी साहब बताइए. Let's come down to final words. जी, आयशा बीबी कौन बोल रहा है?
हाँ, आयशा.
जी, आयशा.
आयशा, go ahead.
No, nothing
Okay.
from me.
Go ahead जी, मेहदी साहब.
नहीं, मेरा जहाँ तक मेरा ख्याल है कि जहाँ की हम बात कर रहे थे, एंड तस्नीम ने भी ये भी बात की है कि इट सो हैपेंस कि जहाँ हमारे यहाँ फॉरेनर आ जाता है डिसीजन मेकिंग में, तो वहाँ पर हमारी जो है रिलेटिवली जिसको कहते हैं पॉलिटिसाइज, हेलो, तो वो जो है उसको न्यूट्रलाइज कर देती है. एंड दिस इज ट्रू कि जो आयशा ने कहा था कि पिछले 30-40 सालों में जितनी भी जहां तक इन्वेस्टमेंट अप्रूवल की बात होती है, वी हैव नॉट सीन एनी इंटरफेरेंस इन दैट. एंड सो उस एरिया में तो मेरा नहीं ख्याल कि आई थिंक वी शुड बी doing that, interfere anything in that, but one area where we should definitely look into, and I don't know whether Aisha will agree with me, is कि जो ये 7 हमारे जो joint ventures हैं, and जो के इसमें दोनों मुल्कों के रिप्रेजेंटेटिव अपनी अपनी जगह बैठे हैं, उनकी जो ऑब्जेक्टिव जो था इन एंटरप्राइजेस का, वो था कि जी ये एक दो मुल्कों के, बिकॉज मोस्ट ऑफ ऑल ऑफ देम आर ब्रदरली कंट्रीज, एंड वहाँ पर जो है दे डिसाइडेड टू सेट अप दीज इंस्टीट्यूशंस so that the two can come closer, because with the help of the business. And this is an attempt, and if we can make use of that, at least these 5 or 6 or 7 ventures, joint ventures, उनका एक at least attempt हो सकता है, at least उसकी कोशिश हो सकती है कि भाई ये, मैं आपको बताऊं नदीम, if I may point out, जिस वक्त मैं पाक कुवैत मैंने ज्वाइन किया, मुझे ताज्जुब ये हुआ कि जब मैं पहली मरतबा कुवैत गया तो मुझे पता चला कि मैं पहला मैनेजिंग डायरेक्टर था जो कि कुवैत गया था. उससे पहले जो हमारे जो फॉर डिफरेंट रीजंस, नॉट दे डिड नॉट लुक इनटू दैट, बट बिकॉज जो ऑब्जेक्टिव जो थे वो इतने ज्यादा, शायद इतना ज्यादा ध्यान नहीं दिया था पास में लोगों ने. तो मेरे कहने का मतलब ये है कि जहां जहां कोशिश हो सकती है, उस कोशिश को तो मेरे ख्याल में एनकैश करना चाहिए. और हम जैसे आयशा बता रही हैं कि इनका Brunei wale jo hain, they are extremely positive towards Pakistan, and we should try to look into creating certain business relations with them and set up enterprises or joint ventures where we can attain, where can be the two countries come together, but at the same time the trade and business can also be promoted through these institutions.
Thank you. Thank you. Aisha Bibi, ये animal है of bilateral investment fund ये और दुनिया में भी है, India में और जगह है, या this is just here in Pakistan? It's a very strange animal. I haven't heard of it before.
Actually, हमारी देखा देखी, Oman and Brunei got together and created a joint venture. But they did it the right way, because we were in our second year of operations and we'd actually given them some information. They went and they created a JV fund. It is a private equity fund. And that's why उनका structure हमसे मुख्तलिफ था, ज़्यादा flexible था. And they could do what perhaps we should be doing over here. मेरी साहब का एक point था कि हम जिस purpose के लिए बने थे, if you look at our articles or even the joint venture agreements, it says you can invest in companies, you can set up entities, you should go do agro finance, you should go and buy, you know, whatever, बहुत wide structure बना हुआ है. So the articles say that. The articles do not only say that आप जाके सिर्फ infrastructure financing करें और सिर्फ project finance करें. It's a very wide structure. But आपने उसको लेकर तो एक regulatory framework में डाल दिया जो कि बैंकों के लिए बना हुआ है. तो अगर आज मैं करना चाहूँ बहुत सी ये एक्टिविटीज तो मैं नहीं कर सकती हूँ, मैं बहुत लिमिटेड सेंस में कर सकती हूँ, बिकॉज आई हैव टू क्रिएट अ पोर्टफोलियो दैट इज एक्सेप्टेबल टू माय लेंडर्स जो मुझे शॉर्ट टर्म पैसे देते हैं, एंड टू माय रेगुलेटर. जहाँ तक मेहदी साहब की बात हुई कि ब्रिंग न्यू इन्वेस्टमेंट, सो आई रिमेंबर फ्रॉम माय डेज इन ओमान, द ओमानीज bought in 1 year they invested $500 million in Pakistan. They bought a bank, they invested in a power project, and they invested in a telecom company.
But they let me ask you another question. Can I ask you another question? Who does your research? Do you do any research, or is there any research done on the DFIs? Because I don't see anything done on the DFIs. They're kind of hidden in the corner.
We are hidden in a corner, but you know, there are also certain centers of excellence which are forgotten. I'm just saying in limited cases, आपने देखा पाक कुवैत ने एक बैंक खरीदा when it was nothing. And today that's the largest Islamic bank that gives the government 3 billion rupees a year in dividend, just their portion. That's a big accomplishment. But the thing is कि bits and pieces में हम करते हैं क्योंकि हमें room निकालना होता है regulations में ये काम करने के लिए, और हम इसको often, you know, it's in bits and pieces. It's because it's not following in our business model which is driven by the regulator. जहाँ तक मेहदी साहब की बात है, अब मैं एक और बात कहना चाहती हूँ, वो जो $500 मिलियन आए थे, शौकत अजीज साहब जहाज पे बैठे थे, इन्वेस्टर कॉन्फ्रेंसेस में जाते थे, he would speak, he would take the time out. I can tell you in 15 years, nobody has gone to Brunei. And it's not for want of you know, reminders or anything. I can only do certain amount at my level, but then at a policy level, somebody needs to stay engaged with their counterparts. वो चीज जो है वो मैंने नहीं देखी जी over here. Nobody really knows.
Salim Raza Saab, looks like the central bank killed it. How would you take that on? Is it market failure? Is it government failure? I come back, it's government failure.
No, you know, perhaps the central bank can't sanction private equity that's got to be approved by SCCP. So if you've got the leeway of being able to set up subsidiaries under a different regulator, then you do have a conduit. You know, why do you have to, you know, the state bank cannot give you, you know, a PE license.
Okay.
SCCP can.
Yeah, but the state bank regulates how much we can invest in these subsidiaries. It is always going to be a non-core business. So when you go into the nitty-gritties of it, we set up...
This actually, no. you're right. Now the issue is who should regulate investment banks, who should regulate private equity. If it's going to be SECP, then we do have this what's the word? Fundamental breach, because universal banks in the West do everything, and most banks are universal banks. They have under the umbrella of their license, they have the right to do all the authority to do investment banking with everything it entails, with the brokerage part, the VC part, the private equity part, and they can also do the commercial banking as long as the investment banking part isn't leveraging
Yes.
from the commercial banking part, or only leveraging up to very small limits. But we have somehow decided that although we allow our banks to do investment banking, although we allow them to in theory, but certain activities that fall under investment banking have to then be approved by SECP, and this is repairable.
It is repairable.
Is repairable. A sensible discussion between the two regulators, and you should get an answer. I mean, if I was in a position to, to sort of make the first move in this, I certainly think it's very well worth trying. Now, it'll probably mean the central bank regulating more. That's probably where it'll turn out. But the effort should be made, because there's no point giving an investment banking license to the commercial banks, which they have, and then curtailing certain activity. You've got to give it a free umbrella. It doesn't work otherwise. It doesn't work effectively. What are our investment banks that are moribund? How many of them lead deals? I'm talking not about you, not about the DFI, about our sanctioned investment banks. I mean, all they do is leasing, which is really term lending, and they borrow. They can't compete with commercial banks because they borrow from commercial banks.
Yeah.
So how are they going to create a bond market? Because they'll take away a big customer of a commercial bank, suddenly introduce him to the joys of being able to borrow cheaper from the bond market. If they do that once, the second time, this big bank's going to say, all right, that's it, no more lending to you. So there is there's a sort of standoff there, which is preventing, I think, dynamism in the investment banking. So who regulates is important. I agree with you, and I think the regulators should really look at this. Initiative will have to come from the state bank, because the state bank is going to say that we are the universal regulator. Our banks can do everything. People we license can do everything. So it's got the bigger size of the cake, and pulling in something from the other side will be easier than going the other way.
Yes, true.
It's interesting that the Federal Reserve does not regulate banks, and England also, the FSA regulates banks. So we have to think about those models.
But the FSA has gone back. The FSA has gone back to the Bank of England in the last year or 18 months.
It has gone back partially, but in the Federal Reserve, there is no regulation of banks by this Federal Reserve. So we have to be careful to think about it. Here we have an all-powerful central bank that we are making more powerful, that is going to regulate everything, but kill the market in regulating, because it's easy to kill the market. Then a moribund market is always very good for a bureaucrat, because the bureaucrat thrives in the moribund market. Anyways, ji, last words, Istiqbal Mehdi Saab, Afaq Tiwana Saab, any last words?
Well, if I may just say, Nadeem, I would like to thank the participants here, and I do feel that there are this kind of discussion just does raise questions. In fact, just now when Aisha was talking about exactly what we should be doing, I remember when I was in Park Kuwait, we were once invited in the State Bank for in the evening, and we sat for about 2 or 3 hours discussing only one thing, and that is what exactly are we expected to do. And we had this meeting for about 3 hours, and we could not come to any conclusion, and it was expected to, we were expected to meet again with the governor, the then governor, but we could not do that again, and we could not meet again. But the point I'm making is that unless we are very clear exactly what are we expected to do, it is very difficult to come to some kind of decision and conclusion. The important thing, and Aisha is right when she says that if we look at the mandate which is given to us, the management, it is relatively very open. You can do anything. But we have to see what is behind, what was the idea behind creating these institutions. The idea is exactly what I was talking about. And this is what, in fact, because I was at that time setting up a new joint venture, which was with Iran, that is why, that was the time when we sat down and discussed. And I'm sure the people earlier for other joint ventures must have sat down also. So at that time we did, and I must say that we had planned to do a lot of things, a lot of joint venture enterprises we were expected to go ahead with, except that unfortunately we could not for various reasons. But the important thing which remains very important, and I really feel this is important, that we must, especially for the institution like where Aisha is doing a wonderful job, and it is probably one of the finest joint venture institution which is going on. But at the same time, I think it will be useful to make more use of it by bringing in Brunei closer to Pakistan, by having some more joint ventures and some more enterprises, and make use of it by doing that. So this is what I wanted to say about these things. And about the other enterprises, I do see that there are issues, there are problems. We are not where we were, let's say 1960s and 70s, where we really were relatively speaking, doing much better in the public sector enterprises. But then again, I think we might like to see what is it which we were doing then and what is it we are doing now. And maybe we can learn something from, by comparing with the two, and make some, move something related to that conclusion.
Very good, Ji. Thank you, Istiqbal Sab. Thank you, the whole panel. Thank you, everybody. I think we had a very good discussion. I think it's wonderful. We should look more into the DFIs, but unfortunately, the issue remains our governance structure. And extreme suspicion and the extreme distrust of talent and the extreme distrust of institutions that exist now, I think it'll be a long time before we can get the market back. And as you all know, people, market participants, market depends on risk premium. Right now, the risk premium are very high in Pakistan because there is no element of trust. There is no element of good governance anywhere. So given that, I think all these discussions will take a long time happening. That's why people like myself, PID, we believe that the first element of thing that has to be done is to talk about the governance structures, our democracy, our civil service, our judiciary, our legal system. We really need to begin to redesign, because a lot depends on how these institutions function. These institutions set your risk premium. Your market will only operate when they can predict a risk premium. Currently, our risk premiums are huge. Our transactions costs are also huge. It is very difficult to set up anything in that. We can go around wishing, but it ain't gonna happen. We will set up more and more institutions, more and more jobs for the boys, but very little effort. Thank you very much. We shall keep you engaged. Istiqbal Sab, let's plan the next one. Thank you.
Certainly.
All the best, folks. Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good
Thank
seeing
you.
you. Thanks, Afaq. Thanks, Aisha. इस्तेमाल इंशाल्लाह
Thank
मुलाकात
you,
होगी.
thank you, Salim. Thank you, Afaq Sahab. Thank you, Aisha. Thank you, Tasneem.